The wind on the high plains was not a gentle thing. It was a predator, a razor-edged hunter that scoured the land, stripping warmth from bone and hope from the heart. For Ilara, cast from the back of a wagon like a sack of unwanted grain, it was the voice of her own demise. The heavy wheels of Bartholomew Croft's carriage had churned the frozen mud and disappeared over the rise, leaving behind only the deepening silence and the shriek of that merciless wind. Her dress, a fine silk meant for a wedding supper in a civilized town, was a cruel joke in this brutal wilderness, its delicate fabric offering no defense against the teeth of the encroaching twilight. She wrapped her arms around herself, a futile gesture against the cold that was already seeping into her marrow, a cold that felt as absolute and final as the grave. The sky, a canvas of bruised purples and angry gray, promised a storm, not of rain, but of ice and snow, a final white shroud for a woman who had dared to believe in a promise. Bartholomew's words echoed in the gale, colder than the air itself. "You are property, and damaged property is discarded." He had bought her, transported her, and now, for a single act of defiance, for refusing his drunken cruelty, he had thrown her away. The last rays of sunlight clung to the western hills, a fleeting stain of gold, before being swallowed by the immense, indifferent darkness of the frontier. This was the end. A quiet, freezing death, alone in a land that cared nothing for her name or her sorrow. Her hope, once a steady flame, was now a flickering ember, and the storm was coming to extinguish it for good. Have you ever felt a loneliness so profound it becomes a physical weight, a crushing presence that threatens to steal the very air from your lungs? Have you ever faced a moment where every path forward seems to have crumbled into dust, leaving you stranded on the precipice of despair? This is the story of such a moment. It is the story of a woman left to the mercy of a savage wilderness, her spirit broken and her future a blank, terrifying void. But it is also the story of an unexpected sanctuary, of a quiet strength found in the heart of a man who had built walls around his own soul. It is a testament to the truth that even in the most desolate of landscapes, the seeds of love can find a way to take root, and that a home is not a place you find, but a fortress you build, hand in hand, against the storms of the world. This is the story of Ilara and Silas, of a love that was never supposed to be, a love forged in the crucible of survival, a love that would prove that the most powerful force on the frontier was not the cold, nor the hunger, nor the cruelty of men, but the unwavering courage of two hearts beating as one. The world had dissolved into a maelstrom of white. The snow did not fall. It flew, a horizontal blizzard that blinded Ilara and stole her breath. Each step was a guess, a desperate plunge into a churning void. The cold was no longer a sensation but an absence, a numbness that had crept from her fingers and toes into the very core of her being. She was a ghost adrift in a sea of ice, her thoughts fragmenting, her memories of a warm parlor in Boston feeling like a story told of someone else's life. She stumbled, her frozen limbs refusing to obey, and fell into a snowdrift that felt as soft and final as a feather bed. It would be so easy to close her eyes, to let the beautiful, deadly silence lull her into that last sleep. Her body yearned for it, for the cessation of pain, for the end of the struggle. But somewhere deep inside, a tiny, stubborn spark of defiance still glowed. It was the part of her that had refused Bartholomew, the part that her father had instilled in her, a quiet integrity that would not be so easily extinguished. She fought to her knees, her breath a ragged plume of frost. And then she saw it. A flicker. A tiny, impossible pinprick of orange light, a star that had fallen to earth. It was so faint, so distant, it could have been a cruel trick of her freezing mind, a final hallucination before the end. But the spark of defiance fanned that flicker into a desperate hope. She began to crawl, her frozen hands raw, her mind focused on that single point of light. It was a beacon in the abyss, a promise in the heart of oblivion. The crawl became a stagger, her body a machine running on the last fumes of will. The light grew, resolving itself into the square of a window, a warm, golden heart beating against the chest of the storm. She reached a wall of rough-hewn logs, her fingers finding purchase on the cold wood. She pulled herself up, reached the door, and her strength gave out. She collapsed against it, her last conscious act a feeble, desperate rap of her knuckles on the unyielding wood before the world went black. The door swung inward, not with a creak, but with a smooth, silent motion. A figure stood silhouetted against the firelight within, a man whose form seemed carved from the very mountains that surrounded them. Silas had heard the faint sound, a scratching more than a knock, a sound that did not belong to the language of the storm. He had lived in this self-imposed exile for 5 years, and in that time, no one had ever come to his door. He stepped out onto the porch, his rifle held loosely in one hand, his eyes, accustomed to the darkness, immediately finding the small, crumpled heap at his feet. He knelt, his movements economical and sure. He saw the fine, ruined dress, the pale, aristocratic face blue with cold, the tangle of dark hair dusted with snow. She was a thing of the civilized world, a world he had long since abandoned. He felt a familiar, bitter instinct to close the door, to leave the world's troubles outside his fortress of solitude. But then her eyelids fluttered, a whisper of a breath escaped her lips, and the part of him that was his mother's son, the part that was a Pawnee warrior, the part that was simply a man of honor, could not turn away. He scooped her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, a fragile bird with broken wings. He carried her inside, into the warmth and the light, and gently laid her on the bearskin rug before the hearth, shutting the door on the howling fury of the storm. The first thing Elara knew was warmth. It was a deep, penetrating heat that seemed to be coaxing her back to life from a great and terrible distance. It was the warmth of the roaring fire in the stone hearth, a living, breathing creature of orange and gold that pushed back the shadows in the small, one-room cabin. The second thing she knew was the scent of pine wood, wood smoke, and something else, something clean and wild like the earth after a rain. She tried to open her eyes, but her lids were heavy, weighted down with an exhaustion so profound it felt like a physical substance. She was wrapped in a thick wool blanket that smelled of cedar, and beneath her was the surprising softness of a fur rug. She was alive. The realization was not a triumphant cry, but a quiet, bewildered whisper in her mind. A shadow moved at the edge of her vision, and a flicker of fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the fog of her exhaustion. Bartholomew. But the shadow that knelt beside her was different. It was lean and quiet, not bloated and loud. A hand, calloused and warm, touched her forehead. It was a gentle touch, assessing and impersonal, but a touch that held no cruelty. She forced her eyes open. The man looking down at her was unlike anyone she had ever seen. His face was all angles and planes, as if carved from weathered rock. His skin was the color of rich earth, and his dark hair was long, tied back with a simple leather thong. But it was his eyes that held her. They were a deep, dark brown, and they held a sorrow so vast and ancient it seemed to contain the memory of 1,000 winters. He said nothing. He simply looked at her, his expression unreadable, a mask of stoic neutrality. He held a wooden bowl of steaming broth to her lips. She was too weak to protest, too weak to question. The broth was hot and savory, tasting of wild game and herbs, and it sent a river of life flowing through her frozen veins. 4 days, this became their silent ritual. He tended the fire, hunted for food, and brought her broth and herbal tea that eased the racking cough that had settled in her chest. He moved with a silent, anachronistic grace, a man perfectly in tune with his surroundings. He rarely spoke, and when he did, his voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder. "Eat," he would say, or "drink this." There were no questions about who she was or how she had come to be at his door. He seemed to accept her presence as he would a stray fawn seeking shelter from a storm, a temporary guest of the wilderness that would move on when it was healed. Elara, wrapped in her cocoon of warmth and silence, began to heal. The fever broke, the cough subsided, and her strength slowly returned. In her waking hours, she watched him. She watched his hands, strong and surprisingly deft, as he repaired a snowshoe or sharpened his hunting knife. She watched the way he stood by the window, staring out at the snow-covered landscape, his posture betraying a loneliness that resonated with her own. She was terrified of him, and yet she had never felt safer. He was a creature of the wilderness that had almost claimed her, Yet he was her savior. He was a complete unknown, a man without a past, and yet he was the only thing standing between her and death. One afternoon, as the low sun cast long blue shadows across the snow, she found her voice. It was a weak, hoarse whisper. "Thank you," she said. He was stirring a pot over the fire and didn't turn around, but he stilled. "My name," she added, feeling a sudden need to reclaim some small piece of herself, "is Alara." He was silent for a long moment. Then, he turned his head slightly, his profile stark against the firelight. "Silas," he said. And in the speaking of their names, a fragile thread was spun between them in the quiet heart of the winter wilderness. As the days bled into weeks, the rhythm of their life in the cabin settled into a quiet routine, a silent language understood through shared tasks and mutual existence. Ilara, no longer confined to the bearskin rug, began to take on a role in their small world. It began with a simple act. Silas returned from his trap lines one afternoon, his deerskin coat covered in a fresh layer of snow, and found that she had taken his worn, torn shirt and mended it. The stitches were small and perfect, a testament to a life of refined domesticity that felt a world away. He looked at the mended tear, then at her, a flicker of something unreadable in his dark eyes. He gave a single, sharp nod of acknowledgement, and that was enough. It was an acceptance. From then on, she found ways to contribute. She learned to grind corn into meal with his heavy stone mortar and pestle. She kept the cabin swept and tidy, bringing a sense of order to the masculine space. She learned the art of banking the fire at night so that a bed of hot coals remained in the morning, ready to be coaxed back to life. These were not the skills she had learned in her father's comfortable Boston home, but she found a deep and surprising satisfaction in them, in the simple, tangible reality of contributing to her own survival. Silas, in turn, began to open his world to her, bit by bit. He taught her how to read the tracks of animals in the snow, pointing out the delicate print of a snowshoe hare versus the heavier tread of a deer. He showed her which barks could be steeped into a tea to soothe a sore throat, and which roots, dug from beneath the snow, could be roasted and eaten. One day, he placed a small, beautifully carved knife in her hand. "To be without a knife in this land," he said, his voice low and serious, "is to be without a hand." The handle was smooth and fit perfectly in her palm. It was not a weapon, but a tool, a key to this new world she inhabited. Their conversations were still sparse, fragments of speech in a vast sea of comfortable silence. But the words they did exchange held weight. "Why are you here?" she asked him one evening, her voice barely a whisper as she watched the firelight dance across his stoic face. He was silent for a long time, whittling a piece of wood with a focused intensity. "The world of men," he said finally, his eyes never leaving his work, "left a bad taste. This place is clean." She understood that. She, too, had seen the ugliness in the world of men. She began to tell him her own story, not all at once, but in pieces, like assembling a broken plate. She spoke of her father's death, of her dwindling finances, of the advertisement for a mail-order bride that had seemed like a lifeline. She spoke of Bartholomew Croft, of his charm that had curdled into cruelty, of the journey west that had felt like a descent into a nightmare. She did not speak of the final, brutal act of abandonment. She was not ready for that. But Silas listened, his hands never ceasing their work, but his attention absolute. He did not offer pity or platitudes. He simply listened, and in his quiet presence, she felt the weight of her shame and fear begin to lessen. He was a repository for her sorrow, his silence a vast, empty landscape where she could lay her burdens down without judgment. In this shared solitude, a bond was being forged, stronger than steel, a bond of mutual reliance and nascent, unspoken understanding. The world outside the cabin remained a frozen, silent tableau of white and gray, but inside, something was beginning to thaw. The winter that had trapped them together had become an incubator, forcing a proximity that was slowly dissolving the barriers between them. The space that had once felt charged with the tension of two strangers was now filled with a comfortable, familiar silence. Ilara no longer saw Silas as merely her gruff savior, but as a man of profound depth and sorrow. She saw the way his eyes would sometimes glaze over, looking at something far beyond the cabin walls, and she knew he was revisiting a place of great pain. The emotional walls he had built around himself were as formidable as the mountains outside, but she was beginning to see the small cracks in the facade. One night, a blizzard raged with a particular fury, the wind howling like a pack of starving wolves. A shutter, loosened by the gale, banged relentlessly against the cabin wall. Silas rose to fix it, and as he returned, shaking the snow from his shoulders, he stumbled, a low groan escaping his lips. He leaned against the wall, his hand pressed to his side. Elara was at his side in an instant. "What is it?" she asked, her voice laced with a concern that surprised them both. "An old wound," he grunted, his face tight with pain. "It does not like the cold." She guided him to a stool by the fire and, without asking permission, began to unlace his shirt. He did not stop her. A long, jagged scar, old and white, ran across his ribs, a permanent reminder of a past violence. She gently probed the area around it, her touch surprisingly sure. "My father was a doctor," she explained softly. "I learned a few things." She prepared a hot compress of herbs, the way he had taught her, and pressed it against the aching scar. He closed his eyes, a sigh of relief escaping him. He did not pull away from her touch. In that moment the roles were reversed. She was the caregiver, and he, the one in need of comfort. The act was intimate, not in a romantic sense, but in a way that transcended it, a pure act of human connection. "The war," he said, his voice rough. It was not an explanation, but a confession. He began to speak, his words slow and measured, as if he were pulling them from a deep, cold well. He spoke of the blue uniform he had once worn, of the terrible things he had seen and done. He spoke of his Pawnee mother and his white trader father, of being caught between two worlds and belonging to neither. And then he spoke of the loss that had driven him here, the loss of his wife and child to a fever while he was away scouting for the army. The words came out, flat and devoid of emotion, yet Elara could feel the cataclysmic grief behind them, a sorrow so immense it had hollowed him out, leaving only this shell of a man. She said nothing. There were no words for such a loss. Instead, she simply kept her hand on his shoulder, her warmth a silent anchor in the storm of his memory. She was no longer just a woman he had rescued, she was a witness to his pain. And he was no longer just a solitary man. He was someone who had let another soul into the desolate landscape of his heart. The fire crackled, the blizzard raged outside, but within the four walls of the cabin, two broken people were beginning, ever so slowly, to piece each other back together. The first sign of spring was not a flower, but a sound. The gentle, persistent dripping of water as the snow and ice on the cabin roof began to melt under a sun that had regained a sliver of its strength. The sound was a promise, a whisper of a world reawakening. With the changing of the season, the atmosphere inside the cabin shifted as well. The quiet companionship, born of necessity and shared hardship, began to blossom into something deeper, more tender. The unspoken affection that had been growing between them in the silent heart of winter now sought small ways to express itself. It was there in the way Silas would leave a small, brightly colored feather he'd found on the table for her, a splash of impossible blue against the rough-hewn wood. It was in the way Elara would save the best piece of roasted meat for him, placing it on his plate without a word. These small gestures became a new language, a dialogue of the heart that required no words. One afternoon, while mending a tear in his buckskin leggings, Elara pricked her finger with the needle. A single, bright drop of blood welled up. Silas, who had been oiling his rifle by the fire, was at her side in an instant. He took her hand in his touch surprisingly gentle. He raised her finger to his lips and, with a solemnity that made her heart ache, he touched the tip of his tongue to the wound. The gesture was shockingly intimate, more profound than any kiss she had ever imagined. A jolt like lightning shot through her. She looked up into his eyes, and for the first time, she did not see the sorrow or the solitude. She saw a raw, unguarded tenderness that took her breath away. He held her gaze for a long moment, the world seeming to stop around them, before he gently released her hand. Neither of them spoke of it, but the moment hung in the air between them, a beautiful, shimmering thing. Later that week, he presented her with a small object. He simply placed it in her outstretched palm. It was a bird, a tiny, perfect wren carved from a piece of pale birchwood. The detail was exquisite. She could see every feather, the bright intelligence in its tiny eye. She knew he must have spent hours on it, carving it by firelight while she slept. It was more precious to her than any jewel she had ever owned. It was a piece of his soul, a declaration made in wood instead of words. "It's beautiful," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. A rare, faint smile touched his lips. "It is a resilient bird," he said. "It survives the winter." The meaning was clear. He saw her, not as the broken, freezing woman he had found, but as a survivor, as someone with a quiet, unbreakable strength. That evening, as she sat by the fire, he came and stood behind her, placing a heavy, warm hand on her shoulder. He did not speak, but the weight of his hand was a comfort, a promise, a statement of belonging. "You are safe here," he said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through her. "Always." And in that moment, Ilara knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that this was no longer a temporary shelter. This small, rough cabin, tucked away in the heart of the wild, was her home. And this quiet, wounded man was her heart. The thaw came in earnest, the world turning from white to brown and then, slowly, to green. The rivers broke free of their icy prisons, and the air filled with the scent of damp earth and new life. With the opening of the land came a sense of unease. Their secluded sanctuary, which had felt like the entire world during the winter, now felt vulnerable. The path that had been buried under feet of snow was now a muddy track, a potential road for the outside world to find them. The thought of leaving, of returning to the so-called civilization that had betrayed her, filled Ilara with a cold dread. She belonged here with Silas. But the choice, she knew, might not be hers to make. The idyll was shattered one bright afternoon. A sound, alien and intrusive, disturbed the peace of the valley, the rhythmic clopping of a horse's hooves, steady and purposeful. Silas heard it first. He stiffened, his head lifting like a stag scenting danger. He moved to the door, grabbing his rifle, his body a fluid and lethal motion. He motioned for Ilara to stay back, away from the window. Through a crack in the door, she saw him, a rider on a large, black horse, dressed in the fine, tailored coat of a wealthy man. The blood drained from her face, and a cold fist of terror clenched in her stomach. It was Bartholomew Croft. He reined in his horse a short distance from the cabin, his eyes, filled with an arrogant condescension, taking in the rustic dwelling. He dismounted with a proprietary air, as if he owned the very ground he stood on. "Well, well," he called out, his voice a sneer that cut through the clean mountain air. "It seems my lost property has found shelter with a savage. I must commend your resilience, my dear Ilara. But the game is over. Come out." Silas stepped out of the cabin, his rifle held loosely at his side, placing himself squarely between the cabin door and Bartholomew. He was a silent, immovable wall of defiance. Bartholomew's eyes swept over Silas, a look of pure contempt on his face. "Step aside, half-breed," he spat. "This is a matter between me and my wife." The word wife was a lash, a brand that Bartholomew tried to burn back onto her skin. But the fear that had once paralyzed Ilara was now mingled with a white-hot rage. This man would not shatter the peace she had found here. He would not take this from her. She stepped out of the cabin to stand beside Silas, her chin held high. "I am not your wife," she said, her voice clear and steady, betraying none of the terror that trembled within her. "And I am not your property." Bartholomew's face twisted into a mask of fury. He had expected a cowering, broken creature he could easily reclaim. He did not recognize this woman, who stood beside a wild man as an equal, her eyes blazing with a strength he had never seen. "You will come with me," he hissed, taking a step forward. "You belong to me. I have a bill of sale that says so." "She belongs nowhere but here," Silas said, his voice dangerously low. "This is her home. Now get on your horse and ride away before you learn what happens to trespassers in these mountains." The air crackled with tension, a prelude to a storm more violent than any winter blizzard. Bartholomew laughed, a harsh, grating sound that was an insult to the quiet dignity of the mountains. "Her home," he sneered, his gaze dripping with disdain as it swept over the small cabin and Silas's buckskin attire. "This hovel? With you? Don't be absurd. She is a lady, accustomed to refinement, not to wallowing in the dirt with your kind. You have filled her head with nonsense, savage." He took another step forward, his hand moving to the polished handle of the pistol holstered at his hip. "Elara, I am a patient man, but my patience has its limits. I am taking you back to town, where you will learn to honor the contract you made. You will learn obedience." Elara's heart hammered against her ribs, but she did not flinch. The woman who had been left to die in the snow was gone, replaced by someone forged in the fire of survival and the warmth of a quiet man's love. She looked not at Bartholomew, but at Silas, and in his dark, steady eyes, she found all the strength she needed. She stood her ground, her small form a bastion of defiance. "I will not go with you," she said, her voice ringing with a conviction she had never known she possessed. "I would rather die in this hovel as a free woman than live in your gilded cage as a slave." The declaration hung in the air, a final, irrevocable severing of her past. Bartholomew's face, already flushed with anger, turned a dangerous shade of purple. The thin veneer of civilization stripped away to reveal the tyrant beneath. "A slave?" he roared. "You ungrateful wretch! I will teach you your place." He drew his pistol, the click of the hammer being cocked a deafening sound in the stillness. But he had underestimated them both. He had seen a damsel in distress and a lone savage. He had not seen a partnership forged in the crucible of a brutal winter. He had not seen a warrior. As Bartholomew raised his pistol toward Elara, Silas moved. He was not just a man. He was a force of nature, as swift and silent as the hawk, as deadly as the cougar. He launched himself forward, not at Bartholomew, but to the side, using his momentum to knock the pistol's aim wide. The gun fired with a deafening crack, the bullet tearing a splintered chunk from the cabin's doorframe, exactly where Elara had been standing a second before. Silas had shoved her behind him in the same fluid motion. The fight was a clash of two worlds. Bartholomew was a brawler, fueled by rage and arrogance, used to getting his way through brute force. Silas was a fighter, disciplined and precise, his movements economical and devastating. He did not waste energy. He used Bartholomew's clumsy lunges against him, turning his opponent's momentum into a weakness. He disarmed him with a sharp, brutal twist of the wrist, sending the pistol flying into the dirt. Bartholomew, enraged and humiliated, charged, his fists flying. Silas met the onslaught, not with anger, but with a cold, focused calm. It was over in moments. A swift strike to the throat, a crippling blow to the knee. Bartholomew crumpled to the ground, gasping and clutching his leg, his fine clothes covered in mud, his face a mask of disbelief and pain. Silas stood over him, his chest heaving slightly, the only sign of his exertion. He was no longer the quiet, solitary man of the cabin. He was the protector, the warrior his people had raised him to be, and his eyes burned with a righteous fire. The aftermath of the violent confrontation was a profound silence, broken only by Bartholomew's pained whimpers and the sigh of the wind through the pine trees. The world, which had contracted to the space of a few feet and the span of a few heartbeats, slowly expanded again. Elara rushed to Silas's side, her hands fluttering over his arms, his chest, searching for injuries. "Are you hurt?" she asked, her voice trembling with adrenaline and relief. He shook his head, his eyes never leaving the pathetic figure of Bartholomew Croft on the ground. He had a split lip and a bruise was already purpling on his cheekbone, but he was otherwise unharmed. He looked down at Elara, and the fire in his eyes softened, replaced by a deep and abiding concern for her. He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "He did not touch you," he stated, his voice a low growl. It was not a question. If Bartholomew had laid a hand on her, the outcome would have been far different. "No," she whispered, leaning into his touch, drawing strength from his solid presence. The threat was over. The ghost that had haunted her, the embodiment of her fear and humiliation, was defeated, brought low by the quiet, honorable man who had become her entire world. The resolution was swift and final. Silas bound Bartholomew's hands with a length of rope. There would be no killing, not here, not in the sanctuary they had built. That was the way of men like Croft, not of men like Silas. "You will take your horse," Silas said, his voice flat and cold as he hauled Bartholomew to his feet, "and you will ride east. You will not stop until you have crossed the great river. If you ever show your face in these mountains again, I will not be so merciful. I will hunt you down like the rabid dog you are." He shoved the terrified, whimpering man toward his horse. Bartholomew, his arrogance shattered, scrambled into the saddle, his face a mess of blood, dirt, and tears. He cast one last hate-filled look at Ilara, and then spurred his horse into a desperate gallop, fleeing the valley as if the devil himself were on his heels. They stood together, watching until he was a tiny speck in the distance, until the sound of his horse's hooves faded completely, swallowed by the vastness of the land. The intrusion was over. The violence was gone. They were alone again, the peace of their valley restored. But something had changed. The confrontation had not broken them, it had tempered their bond, forging it in the heat of conflict into something unbreakable. The unspoken question of their future had been answered. Ilara turned to Silas, her heart so full of love and gratitude it felt as if it would burst. He was looking at her, his dark eyes searching her face, his expression one of fierce, protective tenderness. The silence that fell between them was no longer one of mere companionship. It was charged with all the things that had been left unsaid, all the emotions that had bloomed in the quiet of the winter. He took both of her hands in his. "Stay," he said, his voice rough with emotion. He looked from her eyes to the cabin, and then back again. "This is your home. Stay, and be my wife." It was not a grand, poetic proposal. It was something better. It was a simple, earnest plea from the heart of a man who had thought he would never have a home or a heart to share again. It was a question, a promise, and an anchor, all in one. Tears of joy streamed down Ilara's face as she smiled. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes." The years that followed were etched not in hardship, but in a deep and abiding peace. The cabin, once a lonely outpost for a wounded soul, expanded. Silas, with Ilara at his side, added another room, its windows facing the morning sun. The bearskin rug where she had once lain, half dead, was now the place where their children, a boy with his father's quiet eyes and a girl with her mother's resilient spirit, would play on long winter afternoons. The valley that had been a refuge became a homestead. They planted a garden in the spring, its neat rows of green a testament to their shared labor. Ilara, using the knowledge she had gleaned from her father's medical books, which she had sent for, became a healer of sorts for the few trappers and prospectors who passed through the mountains, her gentle skill a legend in the high country. Silas never lost his wildness, his deep connection to the land, but the profound sorrow that had haunted his eyes was replaced by a quiet contentment. He taught his son the language of the forest, the way of the Pawnee, while Ilara taught both their children to read and write, to understand the world beyond their mountain home. They were a perfect fusion of two different worlds, creating a new one that was entirely their own. Their love was not one of fiery passion, but a deep, slow-burning fire that kept them warm against the occasional storms of life. It was a love expressed in shared glances across a dinner table, in the comfortable silence of sitting together on the porch watching the sunset paint the peaks in hues of rose and gold, in the way his hand would always find hers in the darkness of the night. The carving of the small wren he had given her sat on the mantelpiece, a constant reminder of their beginning, a symbol of their survival and the resilient love that had taken root in the most unlikely of soils. The world of men, with its cruelty and its greed, its Bartholomews and its broken promises, rarely intruded on their sanctuary. They had built their fortress, not of stone and wood, but of mutual respect, unwavering loyalty, and a love as strong and enduring as the mountains that cradled them. They had found their happily ever after, not in a grand palace or a bustling city, but in the heart of the wilderness, a wild and beautiful love for a wild and beautiful land. They were a testament to the enduring power of hope, a living story of how two broken souls could find each other in the midst of desolation and build a life more rich and fulfilling than either could have ever imagined. Their home was not just a place, it was a promise kept, a wound healed, and a love story written on the heart of the frontier. And so, a woman who was left for dead found her life. A man who had closed his heart to the world opened it once more. They found their forever in a world that tried to tear them apart, proving that the most fertile ground for hope is often the soil of despair. If their story of courage and love has touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that even after the harshest winter, spring will always come. Let us know in the comments what it means to truly build a home, and what you believe is the strongest foundation for love. Thank you for joining us on this journey, and don't forget to subscribe for more tales of love against all odds.